everyone. Welcome to our briefing. Gabriella Bellini will be presenting the next topic. Gabriella is a security risk analyst focusing on the Middle East with Crisis 24. She graduated from Sciences Po Paris with a master's in international security and a bachelor's in politics from New York University. Gabriella's primary expertise is in Iran, Iraq, and US-Iran relations. Presenting with Gabriella is Adam Prusakowski. Adam serves as an intelligence analyst on the Middle East and North Africa team. He has spent 21 years residing in and traveling throughout the Persian Gulf region and is a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, where he studied international relations, focusing primarily on the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. Gabriella is going to start off with an overview of the recent Abraham Accords. Gabriella?
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. Greetings to all of our guests. The Abraham Accords in the Middle East, the region is undergoing a major political transformation after the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan agreed to normalize relations with Israel. These agreements reversed a decades-held consensus among Arab states that peace with the Palestinians must actually precede recognition of the Jewish state. And while covert ties have existed between Israel and the Arab Gulf states, mutual security concerns regarding Iran and its regional activities have ultimately taken priority over this traditional support for the Palestinian cause. This has led to what we can now call a drastic shift in regional politics. The agreements between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain were officiated in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. on September 15, 2020. Then Sudan agreed to join the Abraham Accords in October, and finally in December, the Moroccan government announced it would also recognize Israel. Under the Abraham Accords, each country is to establish diplomatic relations with Israel and explore areas of cooperation, primarily in security, and then also in investment, tourism, and direct flights, as well as telecommunications and technology. However, the content of the agreements is relatively basic at times and depends on follow-up agreements between the two countries. Some of these follow-up agreements have already been signed, notably with the UAE, while others have yet to be developed, such as with Sudan. In turn, Israel has stated that it would halt further annexation of territory in the West Bank. And while the Abraham Accords are based on security and commercial interests, they're not necessarily based on trust as mutual and diplomatic deals often are. For example, the normalization between Sudan and Israel was actually a precondition for the US to remove Sudan from the list of countries that sponsors terrorism, and not necessarily by mutual agreements between Sudanese and Israeli authorities to independently improve relations. Further to the stability of these deals, annexation is a domestic political issue bound with the history of Israel's existence. So there's no really saying whether the next prime minister or even the current one will respect this policy, therefore threatening the agreements and potentially leaving the Palestinian cause as an overlooked issue in the Middle East. If Israel does proceed with annexation in the future, the aforementioned states must decide whether this is a deal breaker. And while it'll be difficult to undo the elaborate bilateral ties each state will have already established with Israel by then, the question of security will certainly be the priority. Will the deals yield the desired level of security? We've yet to see. Moving on to the next section concerning efforts to counter Iran, the Abraham Accords were negotiated under a Trump administration, and this administration's maximum pressure strategy against Iran plays a role in the Abraham Accords by becoming more or less an external insurance policy to weaken Iran's influence in the region. Iran's regional activity are indeed cause for concern. For years, there is talk about a so-called Shia crescent, which captures Iran's reach and influence across the region. And some of these examples include Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was conceived by former Supreme Leader Khomeini to spread the revolution, and the group continues to receive Iranian support today. Iran also has significant political and security influence in Iraq, from government to the Popular Mobilization Forces and other Shia militias that lie outside of the PMF structure. Some recent attacks in the region, which have been attributed to Iran or its proxies, reaffirm the motivation that has resulted in normalization with Israel. such as attacks on US-led coalition forces in Iraq, which occur regularly at the hands of Shia militias that are often, if not always, supported by Iran. Then in November 2020, a Saudi Aramco distribution facility in Jeddah was targeted by Houthis in a missile strike. And then in December 2020, an oil tanker in Jeddah was attacked by an explosives-laden boat. All of these are examples that signal a sort of buildup in this tangible threat that Iran poses to regional states and their assets. Most of these attacks have received little to no US response, potentially demonstrating that the country is actually drawing down its military and security support for Arab states. Over to the next section, and concerning the possibility of a US Middle East withdrawal. The US has traditionally acted as the Persian Gulf state's central security guarantor. However, future US involvement in the region does come into question. This new Arab, Gulf, and Israeli alliance to counter Iran comes as the US has increasingly withdrawn forces from the region. However, considering Iran's behavior, Russia's presence, and other important US policy factors, it is unlikely that the US will significantly scale back its presence. To conclude, we've yet to see the position the US will take under Biden administration, whether it will encourage or lead these normalization ties, or whether it will disengage from the region. This concludes my section. I'll hand it over to Adam for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Due to time constraints today, I'll focus solely on the possibility of Saudi Arabia perhaps being next in line to normalize ties with Israel. I do think, however, it's important to preface that a lot may change with the Biden administration. Under the Trump administration, there was a lot of emphasis on resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict without much thought for the Palestinians themselves. And while it remains to be seen what Biden's approach may be, the flurry of activity that we saw regarding Arab states normalizing ties with Israel may decline as his administration focuses on other foreign policy directives, such as the Iran nuclear deal. And with the general exception of Kuwait and Qatar, the response of the Persian Gulf monarchies has ranged from muted to supportive of the recent agreements. And there has been much speculation concerning whether Saudi Arabia may be one of the next Gulf states to normalize ties with Israel. And there is some merit to this speculation. Whilst Riyadh has reiterated its support for a two-state solution, there have been hints that it is not outright opposed to normalization. For example, Bahrain, which is reliant entirely on Saudi and Emirati approval for its foreign policy decisions, could not have been a party to the Abraham Accords without Riyadh's explicit approval. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, has even made remarks suggesting his openness to normalizing Saudi-Israeli relations as well. However, positive remarks in the media and permitting Bahrain to follow in the UAE's footsteps may be as far as the kingdom is willing to go, for now at least. And despite the apparent openness of Saudi Arabia's next generation in leadership, conservative leaders like King Salman or Prince Faisal Al Turki ultimately, ultimately remain in charge. Riyadh has traditionally moved with great concern and caution regarding alterations to its foreign and even domestic policies. Moreover, Saudi Arabia, as the custodian of the two holy mosques, lacks the flexibility that its neighbors have. And Riyadh will inevitably be wary that any normalization with Israel will invite Iranian and Turkish challenges to its status as a prominent Islamic nation in the region and throughout the broader Muslim world. And also, I think it's important to note that Saudi and Israel have long maintained surreptitious ties, particularly in the technology sector for decades. And Saudi Arabia will likely maintain this status quo, and it's unlikely to jeopardize its position as a country viewed by many Muslims as, a very prominent Islamic nation just for bringing out into the open its relationship with Israel. So while you cannot rule out the possibility of Saudi normalizing ties with Israel, it is likely that Riyadh will closely monitor the development of the current normalization agreements, but for now, Riyadh will likely maintain its current clandestine relations with Israel. And if we move on to the conclusion, Israel's normalization agreements with several Arab states represents the emergence of a new regional security alliance. As mentioned earlier, the predominant driving force for overt cooperation is a shared concern of Iran's military activities and its proxy forces in the region. And it's currently unclear how much emphasis the Biden administration will place on normalization, particularly if they focus on reviving the Iran nuclear deal. Nevertheless, the overall warming of ties and speculation of potential rapprochement with other Arab Gulf states does represent a clear shift in the priorities of the Arab states and a strong desire to form an anti-Iran alliance. And what we'll likely see going forward in 2021 is that the peace deals will increase tensions with Iran, which as a result may lead to other Arab states developing overt ties with Israel as the issue of Palestinian statehood is pushed further toward the periphery.